The shuttle hummed softly as it descended, its wings reflecting the crimson light of Xrona V's twin suns. Michael Armstrong glanced at the rugged terrain below, an endless stretch of jagged cliffs and violet vegetation. He hadn't even set foot on the planet yet, but he could already feel the challenge ahead. The Council had declared Xrona V too hostile for human settlement years ago. Michael was here to prove otherwise. "Are you sure about this?" The voice crackled over his comm. It was Declan Hayes, his oldest friend and, for this mission, his partner. Declan was stationed back on the orbiting research ship, but he'd be monitoring every move Michael made. Michael adjusted his helmet and grinned. "Come on, Declan. You know me better than that. When have I ever not been sure? When you tried to surf that active lava flow on Pelion for one," Declan shot back dryly. Michael laughed. "Fair point, but this time's different. This is about more than just me." Yeah, Declan muttered. "Just remember, the moment you look like you're in over your head, I'm pulling you out." Michael leaned toward the cockpit window, taking in the strange beauty of Xrona V. The atmosphere was dense but breathable, provided his filters held up. The gravity was slightly heavier than Earth's, enough to make every step a bit more taxing. And then there were the creatures. The Council's logs were full of warnings. Predators large and small, some with venomous stingers, others capable of blending into the terrain. Michael had studied the data thoroughly, but he knew he was stepping into the unknown. "Touchdown in 30 seconds, the shuttle's automated voice announced. Michael's heart picked up its pace. "Declan, I'm switching to suit comms once I'm out. Keep the line open." "Will do. Just don't go full Michael on me," Declan replied. "You have a habit of turning a simple mission into a legendary adventure." Michael smirked, grabbing his gear and sealing his helmet. "Legendary? I'll take that as a compliment." The shuttle landed with a gentle thud, and the hatch hissed open. The air that rushed in smelled faintly of sulfur and wet moss. Michael stepped out, boots crunching against the gritty, dark red soil. All around him, the landscape stretched into alien vastness. Towering trees with translucent leaves, pools of shimmering liquid that seemed to defy gravity, and strange, spiral-shaped formations that pulsed faintly as if alive. "I'm out," Michael said, scanning the horizon. "No sign of the locals yet." "Good," Declan replied. "No offense, but I'd rather your first day isn't spent running from something with fangs." Michael chuckled. "You're no fun. Where's your sense of adventure?" "I left it back in med school when I signed up for a nice, safe orbiting lab job," Declan said. "Seriously though, just be careful. The locals aren't exactly known for their warm welcome." Michael tapped a few commands into his wrist console, running an atmospheric scan. "So far, so good. Oxygen levels are stable. Radiation's within acceptable limits." "Yeah, but remember," Declan began, but Michael cut him off. "I know. Stay vigilant. Don't poke the wildlife." "Got it." Michael took a cautious step toward a grove of those translucent leaf trees. Each step felt heavier than on Earth, and his muscles strained against the slightly higher gravity. He could feel his heart working harder, his lungs pulling in the unfamiliar air. He paused near one of the trees and ran his gloved hand along the bark. It was warm to the touch and vibrated faintly, as if responding to his presence. "Anything?" Declan asked. "Nothing hostile so far," Michael replied. "Just weird. The trees feel alive." "Alive how?" Declan sounded intrigued despite himself. "Like they're breathing, or maybe reacting to me." Michael glanced at his scanner. No known life signatures in the immediate area, though. Could be a defense mechanism. Declan's voice softened. "This is why you're down there and I'm up here. You always had a knack for noticing things others missed." Michael grinned. "Flattery will get you nowhere, Declan." He continued exploring the area, setting up small sensor beacons to map the surroundings. The land seemed deceptively calm, but he knew that could change in an instant. Xrona V had a reputation for its sudden storms and unpredictable wildlife. "Declan," Michael said, "what's the status on that storm front we saw earlier?" "Still a few hours out," Declan replied. Just keep an eye on the horizon. If it starts looking darker than your ex's mood after you forgot her birthday, head back to the shuttle. Michael rolled his eyes, always with the personal jabs. I'm fine, Declan. I've got this under control. The two men bantered as Michael continued his work. He collected soil samples, analyzed the local vegetation, and carefully documented everything he encountered. Declan offered input from the lab, pointing out patterns in the data that Michael hadn't noticed. Together, they made a solid team, Declan's analytical mind complementing Michael's hands-on approach. A few hours passed before Michael noticed something unusual. In the distance, near a rocky outcrop, a faint light flickered. It wasn't the natural bioluminescence he'd seen in the plants earlier. This was something different. Steady, deliberate, almost like a signal. Declan, you seeing this? Michael asked, pointing his wrist scanner toward the light. Yeah, I'm picking up a faint energy signature. Could be tech. Could be some kind of natural phenomenon. You want to check it out? Michael hesitated. They'd been instructed to avoid unnecessary risks, but curiosity gnawed at him. He glanced at the sky. The storm was still far off and he had time to investigate. Just for a minute, Michael said. I'll keep my distance. Declan sighed. Famous last words. Fine. But the moment it looks dicey, you're out. Understood, Michael said, already moving toward the light. As he drew closer, the light's source became clearer. A small, triangular structure embedded in the rock. It pulsed softly, its surface etched with intricate patterns that glowed faintly. Michael's scanner buzzed with data, unfamiliar energy readings, hints of materials he'd never encountered. This is incredible, Michael murmured. Declan, are you seeing this? Yeah, Declan said, his voice tight with concern. Just be careful, Michael. We have no idea what that thing is or what it does. Michael crouched near the structure, examining it from a safe distance. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to be threatening, at least not yet. But it was a reminder of how much he still didn't know about X-Rona V. Every step here was a gamble, every decision a roll of the dice. For now, Michael decided to leave the structure untouched. He marked its location on his scanner and began the trek back to his landing site. Behind him, the light continued to pulse steadily, a quiet enigma waiting to be unraveled. Heading back, Michael told Declan. No heroics, just one step at a time. Good, Declan said, relief evident in his tone. Let's keep it that way. As Michael walked, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of anticipation. X-Rona V was dangerous, yes, but it was also beautiful, mysterious, and full of potential. This was just the beginning. Chapter 2, First Contact. The next morning, Michael was testing his equipment near a cluster of shimmering, metallic rocks when his scanner blipped unexpectedly. He paused, glancing at the screen. Someone was moving in his direction. His pulse quickened. He'd prepared himself for encounters with the planet's wildlife, but this was no animal. The silhouette moving through the pale mist was humanoid, its gait deliberate. Declan, he whispered into his comm. I've got movement. Humanoid. Declan's voice crackled back instantly. Humanoid? Are you sure? The Council's records didn't confirm any sentient beings down there. Michael kept his eyes fixed on the figure. Well, they were wrong about this place being uninhabitable, weren't they? The figure stepped closer. It stood about Michael's height, draped in what looked like layered, organic fabrics that shimmered faintly under the planet's two suns. Its face, partially obscured by a translucent veil, was framed by ridges that caught the light in subtle hues of blue and green. Large, almond-shaped eyes met his, unblinking but not unkind. Declan, Michael muttered. It's an alien, and it's not running away. Maybe it's deciding whether or not to eat you, Declan said, though his voice carried more curiosity than worry. Michael raised a hand cautiously, palm out. I'm going to try to communicate. Be careful, Declan warned. No sudden moves. The alien stopped a few meters away and tilted its head. Michael opened his mouth to speak, but then realized he had no idea what language, or even sounds, it might understand. Instead, he lowered his hand to his chest and tapped lightly. "Michael," he said slowly, pointing to himself. "Michael." The alien didn't respond. Instead, it placed a long-fingered hand on its own chest and made a soft, melodic sound. "Lyria. Lyria," Michael repeated. He pointed to her, then back to himself. "Michael." The alien's eyes seemed to brighten slightly. Michael decided on she based on the timbre of her voice. Made another sound, a word that seemed to mimic the cadence of his name. Michael smiled. It was a start. "Okay, Lyria," Michael said, taking a small step closer. He held out the scanner in his hand, turning it so she could see. The device emitted a faint glow as it displayed environmental data. "Do you know what this is?" he asked, knowing full well she wouldn't understand the words but hoping she might recognize the device's purpose. Lyria leaned forward slightly, her eyes narrowing as she studied the scanner. She reached out, but stopped short, her hand hovering just over the device. Michael nodded, gently placing the scanner on a nearby rock and stepping back. Lyria picked it up and turned it over in her hands, the faintest trace of a smile playing on her lips. "Hey, Declan," Michael said. "She's examining the scanner. She's not just curious, she's analyzing it. I think she understands technology." Declan sounded intrigued. "You're saying she's intelligent enough to understand your equipment?" "Yeah," Michael replied. "She might even be more advanced than we realized." After a few moments, Lyria set the scanner back down and began speaking, her voice flowing in melodic patterns that seemed to shift in rhythm and tone. Michael couldn't understand the words, but her gestures were deliberate. She pointed at the scanner, then to the metallic rocks, then at him. Felt like a question. "I think she's asking why I'm here," Michael said quietly. "Well, good luck explaining that," Declan replied. "Unless you have an alien-to-human phrasebook hidden somewhere." Michael decided to try the simplest explanation he could manage. He gestured around at the environment, then mimed walking and pointed to himself. "I came here to learn," he said slowly. "To understand your planet." Lyria watched him carefully. She tilted her head, then took a step closer, pointing to herself and then at the ground. Her expression seemed to say, "I live here. This is my home." Michael nodded. "Yes, I know. And I'm not here to harm it." She frowned slightly, then reached down and picked up a small, glowing orb that had been lying among the rocks. Holding it up, she spoke again, her voice steady, as if trying to make him understand. She placed the orb on the ground, and it immediately began to emit a soft, radiant light that spread in a circle around them. "What's she doing?" Declan asked. "No idea," Michael said, watching closely. The light faded, and Lyria pointed to him, then to herself, then to the orb. Her expression was expectant. "I think," Michael said slowly, "she's offering me something. Or testing me." "Testing you how?" Declan sounded concerned. "I don't know," Michael admitted. "But she hasn't attacked me. I think she wants to know if I'm trustworthy." "Well," Declan said, "if anyone can convince an alien that humans aren't all bad, it's probably you." Michael chuckled. "Thanks for the vote of confidence." He reached out and touched the orb. It was warm and vibrated faintly, much like the tree bark he'd examined the day before. Lyria nodded and said something that almost sounded like a word of approval. Then she took a step back and gestured for him to follow. "Declan, she wants me to go with her." "Michael, I don't know if that's a good idea," Declan said. "We don't know anything about her or what she wants." Michael hesitated, then looked at Lyria. Her expression was calm, her body language open. "I think I'll be okay," he said. "She doesn't seem dangerous." "Well," Declan sighed, "just remember, I'm watching everything. The second you look like you're in trouble, I'm calling you back." Michael followed Lyria as she led him toward a nearby ridge. The ground beneath their feet shifted from rocky to a soft, moss-like surface that glowed faintly in the shadows. Michael kept his calm line open, narrating his observations to Declan as they walked. "She's taking me somewhere," Michael said. "Not sure what yet, but this feels more like curiosity than a trap. Just stay sharp, Declan replied. I don't like you walking into unknown territory. I know, Michael said, but this is why I'm here, to make contact, to learn. Lyria glanced back at him, her eyes catching the dim light. There was a flicker of something, understanding, perhaps. Michael wasn't sure yet, but he felt they were starting to bridge the gap between them. Chapter 3, The Challenge. Michael watched the setting suns paint the horizon in bands of deep orange and violet as Lyria led him into a secluded clearing at the edge of her village. The Cerilins stood gathered, their eyes glinting in the twilight. The atmosphere was calm but expectant. Declan? Michael whispered into his calm. This is something big. They're all here. Can you read their body language? Declan asked. They're not armed, are they? No weapons, Michael replied. But definitely some kind of ritual. Lyria mentioned a challenge, but I don't have details yet. Lyria approached him, her expression serious. She touched her chest and spoke in her flowing, musical tongue. Her hand then swept toward the village elders, seated on carved stone chairs. Michael nodded, signaling his understanding even though her words remained a mystery. Do you think they're testing you? Declan asked. Probably, Michael muttered. The challenge she mentioned must be their way of seeing if I belong, or at least if I'm not a threat. Lyria motioned for him to follow her to the center of the clearing. She picked up a curved staff made of iridescent wood and handed it to him. The moment it touched his hands, a murmur passed through the crowd. It felt ceremonial, almost sacred. Well, you've got their attention, Declan said dryly. Lyria stepped close, speaking softly. Michael couldn't understand her words, but her gestures pointing to the forest behind the clearing, miming a defensive stance, were clear enough. She pointed at the staff and then at him, then nodded encouragingly. I think she wants me to use the staff, Michael said. And judging by her gestures, we're heading into that forest. The forest? That doesn't sound promising, Declan said. The reports on Exrona's wildlife weren't exactly comforting. Michael took a deep breath. It's part of the challenge. If I refuse, I could lose their trust. All right, Declan said, his tone resigned. Just promise me you'll be careful. Michael followed Lyria as she led him into the dense forest. The crowd remained behind, their voices fading into the distance. The forest canopy closed overhead, the air growing cooler and heavier. The trees seemed to glow faintly in the dusk, their branches twisting like the arms of a dancer. What's the goal here? Michael asked Lyria, knowing she couldn't understand him. Still, he hoped his voice might prompt some kind of clarification. Lyria glanced back, her expression steady, and pointed toward the shadows ahead. The two of them moved deeper into the woods. Michael's senses sharpened as he scanned the surroundings. Every rustle, every glimmer of light through the leaves set his nerves on edge. Declan, he said, do you have any visuals on me? Barely, Declan replied. Whatever's in that forest is interfering with my sensors. Just stay alert. Lyria suddenly stopped, holding up a hand. Michael froze, gripping the staff tighter. She crouched, inspecting a faint trail in the mossy ground. Michael crouched beside her, watching as she pressed her fingers to the earth and whispered something. What is it? Michael asked, his voice low. Lyria pointed to the trail and mimed a large, slow-moving creature. Michael nodded, understanding that they were following the path of something sizable. Lyria continued leading the way, her movements fluid and deliberate. She glanced back often, making sure Michael was still with her. At one point, she gestured for him to stay still and not move. Michael obeyed, standing motionless as she slipped ahead to check something. After a tense minute, she returned and spoke softly, her tone soothing. She pointed to herself, then to him, then forward. Michael got the gist, we go together. All right, he said quietly. Together it is. The two of them advanced, stepping lightly over the uneven ground. The staff in Michael's hands felt more like a shield than a weapon, but its weight was reassuring. Lyria's confidence bolstered his own, even though the forest's silence was unnerving. I can't get any readings on what's out there, Declan said. Do you see anything? Not yet, Michael replied, his eyes scanning the shadows. But we're not alone. As if on cue, a low growl rumbled through the trees. Michael stopped cold, his heart racing. Lyria glanced at him, her expression calm but alert. She pointed to the staff, then mimicked a defensive stance. Michael tightened his grip and nodded. The sound grew louder. From the underbrush emerged a creature unlike anything Michael had seen before. Massive, with a sleek, scaled body that shimmered in the dim light. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its movements were slow but deliberate. Lyria stepped forward, speaking in a low, melodic tone. The creature hesitated, its head tilting as if listening. Michael held his breath, unsure of what she was saying. When she gestured for him to stay still, he obeyed. Minutes felt like hours as Lyria continued speaking. The creature remained still, its glowing eyes fixed on her. Finally, it let out a deep huff and turned away, disappearing into the forest. Michael exhaled slowly. What just happened? Not sure, Declan said. But you're still in one piece. Lyria turned to Michael, a faint smile on her lips. She placed her hand on his shoulder, her touch light and reassuring. She gestured for them to return to the village. Michael nodded, feeling a strange mixture of relief and pride. As they made their way back, Michael glanced at Lyria. Thanks for that. I'm guessing I owe you one. She didn't respond with words, but her warm expression said enough. Together, they stepped out of the forest and into the clearing, where the Cerilin greeted them with nods and murmurs. Michael handed the staff back to Lyria, who held it high and spoke a few words to the gathering. The crowd's reaction was quiet but positive, as though he'd pee. A small, encouraging nod. Michael smiled. It wasn't a full acceptance into their tribe, but it was a step in the right direction. Chapter 4. Night in the Phantasm Forest. The Phantasm Forest stretched out before Michael like a maze of twisted trunks and glowing fungi. He adjusted the straps on his pack, glancing over his shoulder at Declan's image on the wrist display. Still think this is a bad idea, Declan said. His voice was faint, distorted slightly by the dense foliage between them. Michael smirked. Noted, but if we're going to understand this place, I need to see it at its most dangerous. Dangerous doesn't begin to cover it, Declan shot back. You've read the reports, Michael. Predators, venomous plants, quicksand that glows for no apparent reason. The locals don't come here for a reason. Michael nodded toward Lyria, who was crouched a few feet away, examining the ground. The locals are here now. Lyria turned her head slightly, catching Michael's eye. She held up 2 fingers and then pointed down a narrow, winding path. Her expression was calm, but her movements were deliberate. Michael gave a short nod and followed her lead. Declan groaned. What is she saying? She's telling me to follow quietly, Michael replied. He lowered his voice. Declan, I'll check in every hour. If I go silent for more than 10 minutes, I'm calling it. Declan interrupted. I don't care what kind of trust-building exercise you think this is. You're my friend first and a scientist second. Michael smiled, though Declan couldn't see it. Understood. 10 minutes. Lyria gestured for Michael to stop, then pointed to a cluster of enormous flowers that pulsed with a faint blue light. She whispered something and tapped her hand against her ear. Michael tilted his head, trying to follow her meaning. Something about sound? He guessed aloud. Lyria nodded, then pointed to her mouth and shook her head. No sound. Michael understood. They were entering an area where noise could attract something or someone they didn't want to meet. Declan, going silent for now, Michael said. I'll check in at the hour. Roger that, Declan replied, though his voice was edged with worry. Stay safe. Michael muted his calm and gestured for Lyria to lead the way. She moved gracefully, her steps barely disturbing the mossy ground. Michael followed, doing his best to mimic her movements. The forest seemed to come alive around them, glowing softly in shades of green and gold. Insects with translucent wings darted from tree to tree, their bodies leaving trails of light in the air. They walked for what felt like hours, pausing occasionally as Lyria examined the flora or left small, carved markers on tree trunks. Michael noticed how she seemed to tune into the forest, as if listening to its rhythms. He was about to break the silence to ask her a question when she held up her hand and froze. Michael stopped, gripping the staff she'd given him. Lyria crouched low, her eyes scanning the dense underbrush ahead. A faint rustling sound reached his ears, growing louder with each passing second. Lyria turned and pressed a finger to her lips, then pointed to a large, hollow log nearby. She motioned for Michael to hide inside. He hesitated for a moment, then nodded and crept toward the log. As he crouched inside, he could just make out Lyria's form slipping into the shadows. The rustling grew louder. Michael's pulse quickened. He gripped the staff tightly, his senses straining in the dim light. Then, out of the underbrush, a creature emerged. It was massive, with thick, segmented armor that shimmered like polished stone. Its multiple legs clicked against the ground as it moved, and its antennae swayed, as if searching the air for a scent. Michael held his breath, not daring to move. The creature's glowing eyes swept the area, pausing near the hollow log. Michael's grip tightened. He didn't know if the staff would even be effective against something this large, but he was ready to find out if it came to that. The creature's head turned sharply, and its body tensed. Michael followed its gaze and saw a faint flicker of movement, Lyria, darting between two trees. She let out a low whistle, just enough to draw the creature's attention. It turned toward the sound and began to move away from Michael's hiding spot. For a moment, Michael considered running to help her, but she had already vanished into the shadows again. The creature lumbered after her, its glowing eyes fading into the distance. Michael waited until the forest fell silent once more. He emerged cautiously from the log, his heart pounding. Lyria appeared a moment later, slipping out of the darkness like a ghost. She gave him a small, reassuring smile, then gestured for them to keep moving. As they continued through the forest, Michael couldn't help but admire her composure. She just led a giant, armored predator away from him without so much as a scratch. Her calmness in the face of danger was something Michael wasn't used to, but it made him feel more secure. When they finally stopped to rest, Lyria motioned for him to sit on a flat rock. She took a small, round fruit from her pouch and handed it to him. Michael hesitated, then took a bite. It was sweet with a slightly bitter aftertaste, but it filled his mouth with a cooling sensation. "Thanks," he said. Knowing she wouldn't understand the words, he pointed to her, then made a walking motion with his fingers. "You're good at this." Lyria tilted her head, watching him closely. After a moment, she pointed to herself, then to Michael, and finally to the staff. She made a gesture that resembled a flowing river, then held up two fingers and tapped her chest. Together, Michael understood. They were a team. "Yeah," he said softly. "Together." Lyria smiled faintly, and they sat in companionable silence, surrounded by the glow of the phantasm forest. For the first time since he'd landed on Exrona V, Michael felt like he wasn't just surviving. He was beginning to understand. Chapter 5, The Ritual of Seasons. The air in the village buzzed with a strange energy as the Serilin prepared for their most important festival. Michael stood at the edge of the main square, watching as colorful streamers of bioluminescent silk were draped over wooden arches. Lyria worked nearby, her hands deftly tying knots and arranging glowing orbs of light. She caught Michael's eye and smiled, a brief moment of connection in the midst of the preparations. "Declan," Michael said into his calm, "you seeing this?" The static-filled reply came quickly. "Barely. Your camera's picking up a whole lot of bright colors and not much else." "What's going on?" "It's their seasonal ritual," Michael explained. "I think it's tied to the planetary cycles. They celebrate the changes, honor their environment, that sort of thing." "Sounds like a party," Declan said. "Just don't get so caught up in it that you forget why you're there." Michael chuckled. "Noted. I'll keep my scientist hat on." Lyria approached him with a delicate, spiraling staff made of some shimmering material that pulsed faintly in the fading light. She gestured toward it, then handed it to Michael. Her expression was a mix of excitement and something else, maybe trust. Michael took the staff carefully, feeling the cool, smooth surface under his fingers. "What's this for?" he asked, though he knew she wouldn't understand his words. Lyria just smiled and motioned for him to follow her toward the central platform. "Declan," Michael murmured. "Looks like I'm part of the ceremony." "Just don't break anything," Declan replied. "They might not take kindly to it." The platform was circular, surrounded by intricately carved stone pillars. As Michael stepped onto it, the gathered Serilin fell quiet, their luminous eyes reflecting the glow of the floating orbs above. Lyria joined him, carrying a smaller, more ornate staff of her own. She stood next to him and began speaking in her flowing, melodic language, her voice rising and falling like a song. "She's saying something important," Michael whispered. "I just wish I knew what." "Maybe you'll find out if you live through it," Declan said. As Lyria spoke, she pointed to the sky, then to the ground, and finally to Michael. The crowd murmured softly, their tone neither hostile nor overly enthusiastic. It was more of a cautious curiosity. Lyria then gestured for Michael to raise his staff. He did so, holding it upright as she mimicked the motion. A low, humming sound began to resonate from the pillars around the platform, vibrating through the air. "What's happening now?" Declan asked. "No clue," Michael replied, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think it's supposed to happen." Lyria's voice grew louder, more commanding. She turned to Michael and nodded once, her expression encouraging. Michael hesitated, then spoke in English, his voice steady. "I don't know your words," he said, "but I'm here to understand, to learn. I mean no harm." The Serilyn didn't seem to understand his words, but something in his tone made a few of them nod slightly. Lyria turned back to the crowd, her gestures flowing as she continued speaking. The hum of the pillars grew stronger, and the floating orbs began to drift slowly around the platform. "Michael, this is starting to look a little intense," Declan said. "It's fine," Michael replied. "I think this is all part of the ritual." Lyria took a step closer to Michael and gently placed her hand over his on the staff. Her touch was light but firm, and her eyes met his, silently urging him to stay calm. Together, they lifted the staff higher, and the humming reached a crescendo. For a moment, the entire village seemed to hold its breath. The air was thick with anticipation. Then, as suddenly as it started, the humming faded. The orbs stilled, hovering in place like tiny suns. Lyria lowered her staff and gestured for Michael to do the same. The crowd erupted into cheers. The Serilyn clapped their hands in a rhythmic pattern, their voices lifting in what sounded like a celebratory chant. Michael glanced at Lyria, unsure what had just happened, but her wide smile was infectious. She reached out and took his hand briefly, giving it a small squeeze before letting go. "Declan," Michael said, "I think we just completed their ceremony." "Seems like you didn't mess it up," Declan replied. "I'll call that a win." The festivities continued into the night. Music filled the air, created by strange, stringed instruments that resonated with a hauntingly beautiful tone. Serilyn danced in slow, graceful movements, their bioluminescent clothing leaving streaks of light in their wake. Michael stayed near Lyria, letting her guide him through the unfamiliar customs. They shared a meal of sweet, glowing fruits and soft, spongy bread that melted in his mouth. At one point, Lyria motioned for Michael to join the dance. He hesitated, feeling the weight of the day's events, but her encouraging smile was impossible to resist. As they moved together, the rhythm slow and steady, Michael felt a surprising sense of ease. Lyria's movements were fluid and confident, and she guided him without words, showing him the simple steps. By the time the suns began to rise again, Michael was sitting on the platform's edge with Lyria. The village was quiet now, the celebrants either resting or quietly tidying the square. Lyria handed Michael another piece of fruit, her eyes warm with the kind of understanding that went beyond language. Michael took a bite and leaned back, gazing at the soft light of the dawn. "That," he said, glancing at Lyria, "was something else." She didn't answer, but her smile said enough. Chapter 6. The Gathering Storm. The weather on Exrona V was unlike anything Michael had experienced before. The air grew heavier by the hour, and strange, dark clouds swirled above the jagged cliffs on the horizon. Lyria had been busy since morning, gathering supplies and speaking rapidly with her people. Michael stood nearby, trying to piece together what was happening. "Declan, are you seeing this storm system?" Michael asked into his wrist comm. Declan's voice crackled through. "I see it. That thing's a monster. And from what the Serilyn's records say, It's not just wind and rain. Those clouds carry enough static charge to knock out your equipment. And maybe you. Great, Michael muttered, glancing up at the roiling sky. Lyria approached him, her expression serious. She handed him a bundle of heavy fabric and made a motion, pulling it tightly over her own shoulders. Michael mimicked her movement, wrapping the cloth around his body. It wasn't much of a shield, but it was better than nothing. Declan, she's gearing up for the storm, Michael said. It's going to hit soon. You don't say, Declan replied, his sarcasm thinly veiling his worry. You have a plan? Michael watched as Lyria began tying down the village's larger structures with thick, vine-like ropes. She gestured for him to help, pointing at a nearby shelter whose walls flapped in the rising wind. Michael moved quickly, grabbing the ropes and mimicking her motions. She's securing the shelters, Michael said into his calm. I'm helping her hold them down. Good call, Declan said. The more anchored you are, the better. Lyria appeared beside him again, handing him a wedge-shaped piece of metal. She pointed to the ground, then mimed driving it into the soil. Michael nodded and began hammering the stakes into place, securing the ropes more firmly. The wind picked up, and the eerie, low hum of the approaching storm made it hard to concentrate. Hey! Michael shouted over the noise. Are you sure this is enough? Lyria glanced at him and gave a small nod, her expression calm despite the chaos. She said something Michael couldn't understand, then tapped her chest and pointed at him. Together. He nodded, feeling the meaning even if he couldn't follow the words. The storm hit with a deafening roar. The wind howled, tearing at the village's structures. The sky lit up with strange, forked lightning that danced horizontally across the clouds. Michael ducked as a loose piece of fabric whipped past his face, and he tightened his grip on the ropes. Michael, Declan's voice came through faintly. Your comm signal is breaking up. Are you okay? Still here, Michael yelled, holding down the shelter. Lyria appeared at his side again, gripping the ropes beside him. The two of them fought against the wind, their movements almost synchronized. When one of the stakes began to give, Michael threw his weight against it, while Lyria lashed an extra rope around the corner of the shelter. Their combined efforts kept it from collapsing entirely. As the storm raged on, they moved from one structure to the next, securing what they could. At one point, a section of the main gathering hall's wall began to tear away. Michael and Lyria ran to it together, bracing the panel as best they could while the storm threatened to rip it free. Michael! Declan's voice was barely audible. You need to find cover. Not yet, Michael shouted. We're almost done. Lyria pointed to a final set of ropes near the hall's entrance. Michael nodded and followed her, the two of them pulling and tying as fast as their hands allowed. The wind whipped around them, and Michael felt the sting of rain on his face, but Lyria's steady presence kept him focused. Her calm determination was like an anchor in the chaos. Finally, the last knot was tied, and Lyria gestured for Michael to follow her into the shelter. Inside, it was still noisy, but the walls held. Michael slumped against one of the support beams, catching his breath. That was insane, he said, looking at Lyria. She met his gaze, her expression softening for the first time since the storm began. She said something, her tone light but firm, and touched his shoulder briefly before sitting down beside him. Declan, I'm inside, Michael said. I think we're safe. Thank God, Declan replied, relief evident in his voice. Stay there until that thing passes. The hours dragged on as the storm continued to batter the village. Michael and Lyria sat side by side, not speaking but sharing a quiet understanding. He marveled at her strength, her unwavering focus in the face of danger. She had guided him through the worst of it. And now, in this moment of relative calm, he felt a connection he couldn't quite put into words. When the storm finally passed, the village emerged into the faint light of dawn. The damage was extensive, but the structures still stood. Lyria and Michael stepped outside, surveying the aftermath. Her people were already moving to repair what they could, their voices rising in determination. Michael glanced at Lyria. "We made it," he said. She didn't understand the words, but she nodded, her eyes meeting his with a quiet acknowledgement. They stood together, watching as the village began to rebuild, their shared effort during the storm strengthening the bond between them. Chapter 7: The Bond. The days after the storm brought a strange calm. The Cerilin village was busy with repairs, their glowing threads and steady hands making short work of damaged structures. Michael spent the mornings helping with heavier tasks, lifting fallen beams, resetting structural supports, while the afternoons were quieter, often filled with long walks through the outskirts of the village with Lyria. "Michael, you're not a carpenter," Declan said through the calm one day, his voice tinged with amusement. "Why do they have you lifting stuff?" "Because I'm the one who can handle heavier loads," Michael replied, sweat dripping from his brow as he adjusted a beam into place. "They've got tools, but not a lot of brute force." "I guess that makes sense," Declan said. "Just don't throw your back out. I don't want to explain that in the report." Michael grunted in response, then turned back to Lyria, who was motioning for him to hold the beam steady. She spoke softly, her words a rhythmic flow that he still couldn't understand. But her tone, her gestures, those he could follow. He nodded, bracing the beam until she secured it with a line of glowing thread that hardened into a firm bond. When they finished, Lyria stepped back and wiped her hands on her robe. She tilted her head at Michael, her gaze thoughtful. Then she pointed to him and said something that sounded like a question. "Declan," Michael muttered, "any chance you caught that?" "Not a word," Declan said. "But it sounded like she was asking something. Maybe she wants to know why you're sweating so much." Michael chuckled and pulled a water bottle from his pack. He took a long drink, then held it out to Lyria. She hesitated before taking it, studying the container curiously before sipping. Her eyes widened and she smiled, handing it back with a soft, melodic laugh. "Glad you liked it," Michael said. "You'd probably find our food just as weird." Lyria gestured for him to follow, and he did, carrying his pack over one shoulder. They walked through the village, past clusters of Cerilin weaving new coverings for the damaged buildings. The light from the planet's twin suns filtered through the translucent leaves overhead, casting shifting patterns on the ground. Lyria led him toward a quieter area at the edge of the village, where a stream of sparkling water wound its way through the forest. "Nice spot," Michael said, crouching down by the stream. He dipped his hand in the cool water and let it run through his fingers. Lyria sat beside him, her long legs tucked gracefully under her. She leaned over Ein, her lips curving into a faint smile. She reached out and placed a hand on his arm, a light touch that made him pause. Her fingers were cool, her skin faintly shimmering in the dappled sunlight. Michael wasn't sure what to do. The gesture felt personal yet calm. Not a demand, not a question, just a connection. He looked at her, meeting her gaze directly. She didn't look away. After a moment, she traced a line on his forearm, her touch featherlight, before pulling her hand back. "That was something," Michael said, more to himself than to her. He could feel the warmth in his face, a mix of curiosity and nervousness. Lyria gave a small laugh and stood, motioning for him to follow her. "Declan," Michael murmured. "I think she's trying to tell me something." "Tell you what?" Declan asked. "What's she doing?" Michael watched as Lyria walked along the edge of the stream, her movements almost like a dance. "I don't know, but it's not hostile. She's just, I don't know, connecting. Maybe she's trying to show me something." "Well," Declan said, "if she was going to feed you to something, I think she'd have done it by now." "Helpful," Michael replied, though his voice was more amused than annoyed. He followed Lyria down the stream, their steps crunching softly against the moss-covered stones. Lyria stopped again, this time near a cluster of large, glowing flowers. She picked one and held it out to him. Michael took it carefully, feeling its soft petals that seemed to hum faintly. She spoke a few words, her voice low and melodic, then gestured to the flower and to him. "You're giving this to me?" Michael asked. Lyria nodded, her smile widening. "Well, thank you," he said, tucking the flower into his pack. "I'll take good care of it." Lyria reached out once more, resting her hand on his shoulder. The gesture was brief, but it carried weight. Michael felt an odd sense of understanding pass between them, as if the language barrier didn't matter in that moment. Lyria turned and began walking back toward the village. motioning for him to follow. Michael stood there for a moment watching her go. Then he started after her, his mind buzzing with questions he couldn't yet ask and emotions he hadn't expected to feel. Something had shifted between them, not just trust, but something deeper, something more personal. And as they walked side by side, he realized that their bond was no longer just about survival or curiosity. It was something more profound. Chapter 8. Proving Them Wrong. The moment Michael stepped onto the council's gleaming chamber floor, the low murmur of alien voices fell silent. Rows of representatives from countless species filled the circular auditorium, their holographic screens shimmering with data, maps, and past findings about Xrona V. Michael adjusted the collar of his uniform, acutely aware of the skeptical stares boring into him. "You ready for this?" Declan's voice buzzed in his ear. "Ready as I'll ever be," Michael muttered under his breath. He took a deep breath, glanced at Lyria standing just behind him, and approached the central dais. A tall, spindly alien with metallic, reflective skin, Counselor Yeth, rose from their seat, folding their 6 arms with a subtle air of authority. "Human, we are eager to hear your findings, though I must remind you that no species has ever managed prolonged survival on Xrona V. Our decision to deem it uninhabitable was based on overwhelming evidence." Michael nodded. "I understand the Council's position. That's why I'm here, to share what I've learned." Lyria stepped forward, her quiet, dignified presence drawing attention. She carried a small, glowing device, one of the Saralin's memory orbs, cradled in her hands. The council members leaned forward slightly, their collective curiosity piqued. Yeth tilted their head. "And what is that?" "It's a record," Michael explained. "The Saralin's history, their knowledge of the planet. Lyria is their voice today." "Proceed," Yeth said. Michael glanced at Lyria, who nodded. He turned back to the council. "When I first arrived, I expected a hostile, unlivable environment. Instead, I found a thriving, intelligent society that has existed in harmony with the planet's extreme conditions for centuries. The Sarilin don't just survive, they flourish. They've developed technologies that we haven't even begun to imagine, methods of resource management that could teach every species here something valuable." There was a ripple of reaction. Some counselors murmured to one another, others leaned back skeptically. "And how?" another counselor asked. "Did you manage to adapt so quickly?" "Surely, human physiology." "It wasn't just me," Michael interrupted. He gestured to Lyria. "It was their guidance, their willingness to teach me how to coexist with the environment rather than fight against it. They showed me how to respect the land, to work with it." Yeth raised one hand, signaling for silence. "This cooperation is intriguing, but you have not yet provided evidence that humans could replicate your experience. A single anecdote does not alter our policies." Michael stepped back and motioned to Lyria. She activated the memory orb, and a projection flared to life, a visual record of the Saralin's daily life on Xrona V. The council watched as scenes unfolded. The Sarilin harvesting glowing fruits from the phantasm forest, crafting advanced tools from the planet's unique minerals, and performing intricate ceremonies that strengthened their community bonds. "Humans aren't the only ones who adapt," Michael said as the projection played. "This isn't just about humanity proving itself. It's about recognizing that the so-called uninhabitable isn't always what it seems. The Sarilin have found balance, and we can learn from that." A counselor with scaled, emerald-hued skin spoke up. "Even if your findings are true, what would you have us do? Change the designation of Xrona V? Open it to further human exploration?" "No," Michael said firmly. "I'm not asking for exploitation. I'm asking for respect. The Sarilin don't need or want an influx of settlers, but they do deserve recognition. And perhaps, in understanding their way of life, we can find ways to improve our own." Lyria spoke then, her voice melodic and calm. Though the council needed a translator, her tone conveyed her sincerity. She described how the Sarilin had lived through countless cycles of the planet's extreme weather, their culture built around cooperation and innovation. The counselors watched, captivated, as she explained how the Cerilin's methods could inspire new approaches to sustainability and harmony across the galaxy. By the time she finished, the chamber was quiet. Yeth leaned forward, their reflective skin catching the light. You propose that the Cerilin and their methods be studied, not to colonize but to learn? Michael nodded. Exactly. This isn't about claiming new territory. It's about understanding that survival isn't always about brute force or technology. Sometimes it's about humility and listening to those who know the land best. The council conferred in hushed tones for several minutes. Finally, Yeth turned back to Michael and Lyria. Your findings warrant further consideration. The council will form an exploratory delegation, limited in number and purpose, to establish a dialogue with the Cerilin. Xrona V's designation will remain for now, but we will reevaluate based on the delegation's report. Michael exhaled, relief washing over him. He looked back at Lyria, who gave him a subtle, approving nod. Thank you, Michael said. That's all we hoped for. Yeth raised a hand. One last question. Why did you risk so much for this mission? You could have left the planet at any time. Michael hesitated, then glanced at Lyria. Because I wasn't just surviving. I was learning what it means to truly live, and to share that understanding with the rest of the galaxy. As he and Lyria left the chamber, the chatter of the council faded into the background. Outside, Michael looked up at the unfamiliar constellations and smiled. He wasn't sure what the future held, but he knew one thing. Their work wasn't over. It had only just begun.